To start off by saying congratulations on the film. I've had a chance to sit down and watch it, and I loved it. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
So Joe, tell us a little bit about where this journey with this film first began for you.
My first film was called Danger God. It was about B-movie stuntman Gary Kent. He was the inspiration for Brad Pitt's stuntman character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And Gary introduced me to Bob Burns. Bob was he was a serial blood donor, which is kind of appropriate for what he ended up doing. And he had reached the 5-gallon limit. And the blood bank in Austin, Texas, had a special event for him. And so I went, and I was a film columnist at the time, and I went and talked to him. And at the end, he handed me a script called Rondo and May. It was kind of a love story about Rondo Hatton and his wife. And so when I was done with this first film, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do, my editor started sending me stuff about Bob Burns, video he'd taken of him. And then he showed the video of that day at the blood bank. And I didn't know him at the time. And I said, did I just walk in the room? He said, yeah, there you are. And it seemed kind of like kismet. I was interested in doing there's enough to do a movie about Bob Burns, but I was interested more in the intersection of these two guys' lives, two guys who never met. Bob Burns was a very ordinary-looking guy who was weird in a good way. He was very creative. And Rondo was a very normal guy, or average guy, all-American kid, who had this condition, acromegaly, that caused his appearance to become distorted. And they both had challenges because of these things. So I wanted to tell that story. That's what interested me.
So going back a little bit for our listeners who haven't had a chance to see the documentary so far, where did Robert's kind of obsession with Rondo start? Where did that originate for him?
Bob was kind of a collector, and he collected people as well as other things. And he was interested in seeing Rondo on the creature features late at night. It started when he was a teenager, and then he went to the University of Texas, and he wrote like class papers about Rondo. And my belief is that he was looking at Rondo as kind of a stand-in for what he felt his inner ugliness was. Bob was not particularly happy. He felt he couldn't connect with people very well. So that's kind of his tragedy. Bob was the art director on the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and really created the look of classic horror. And, as I said, I think a documentary about Bob would be just fine by itself, but that didn't interest me. And I was fascinated by Rondo's story, particularly because Bob had handed it to me. We didn't adapt his screenplay by any means, but it was certainly inspiration for telling both of their stories. We have it's a weird thing that we've created, because some people want more of Bob Burns. I went to the Cinema Wasteland in Cleveland, Ohio, and the guy there was a giant Bob Burns fan. He just wanted more Bob. And then I went to Horrible Imaginings, a big film festival in Santa Ana, California. And that guy didn't know who Bob Burns was, but he was a giant Rondo fan. So I have this kind of thing that people want different things with this movie. And it's half traditional documentary, half recreations of these men's lives. So I put a big challenge on my plate, and I'm happy to have done that.
Yeah,
created something that I think is pretty interesting.
That was actually going to be my next question. Of course, Bob is such an interesting character and such an icon in the horror genre that you could easily have made a documentary just about him. Did it kind of worry you about doing the documentary about both men, knowing that you could have ended up with a massive running time, and as you said, fans of both going, I wanted a little bit more of my favorite?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and as it was, we cut a lot, which is kind of what you have to do when you make a film. You eventually have to get brutal with it and cut stuff away. It was mainly about Bob. There are more details about his career that we cut away. A lot of stuff in Austin. He was in Austin making movies. He went to Hollywood and did these films. Did Chainsaw, then he went to Hollywood and did Hills Have Eyes, The Howling, Reanimator, and then he just didn't like Hollywood. So he came back to Texas, and he kind of eked out a career. He was mostly poor, but he was doing the creative work that he wanted to do. He was always a guy who wanted to create stuff. So yeah, there could easily be just a Bob Burns documentary, but that wasn't what I was after, because for me, making what interests me in making a film is the human truth. I'm interested in what makes people tick, and so that's kind of where I was headed with this, and I hope I accomplished that to some degree.
Definitely. Joe, where did the idea come about for you to do the recreations in the film as well? Because I think that's what sets this documentary apart from so many other docos that are out there.
Yeah, you either love it or you hate it. I'm a film writer, and I went to the South by Southwest Film Festival, and I saw a film called Becoming Bond about George Lazenby, who was the one-time James Bond, and could have been more if you wanted to. And that film was George Lazenby sitting in a chair, well lit, everything great, and the other half of it was recreations from his life, from his youth, using an actor who didn't particularly look like him. So neither Bob or Rondo is alive. So I was thinking about, how do we do this? And so I went to the theater department of the local college and said, who you got? I need someone to play Bob. And the guy said, I got one guy who looks more like him, one guy who's a better actor. So from having seen Becoming Bond, I said, give me the better actor. So that's what we settled in with. And we took it a step further, because it felt like we couldn't have too much of the real Bob on camera, so we even recreated things that are exactly Bob's words, like an interview he did for the very first Texas Chainsaw Massacre documentary. We have our actors saying the words that Bob said in deleted interview footage from the film.
Wow. So, yeah. It looks absolutely fantastic, and you've got some brilliant archival footage in there as well. How many hours of archival footage did you find yourself going through before deciding what exactly you were going to use?
It's like a day-to-day decision when you're going through the editing process. So yeah, we had a ton, and I had the other challenge of, I have these two guys, and I have to not focus on one too long on camera without switching over to the other guy. I want you never to get to the point where you're saying, well, where's Rondo? Or where's Bob, as we're going along? And on the wall of our editing office, I had color-coded Post-it notes. One color for Bob, one color for Rondo, some that were half and half. We're both really entered into it. And I shuffled those around as we edited. Probably drove my editor crazy. So there are those kind of challenges, and it's the choices that you make for what to include in the film and what not to include in the film that I think are important. I think that's for storytelling in general. You have to figure out what to leave out, what's truly important.
Definitely. Joe, yeah, I have to ask, were you a horror fan before going into this documentary? Because you've ended up interviewing the who's who of the horror world for this doco. Were you a big horror fan when you were growing up?
I was. I grew up in Austin, Texas, and we had cable television, and cable television meant that you got stations from San Antonio, which is about it, which is, nearby city. And in San Antonio, they had a thing called a Friday night program called Project Terror, where the scientific and the terrifying merge. And so I grew up watching these movies on Friday nights and scaring myself witless. So I saw all these classics, and I was very much into it.
I find that when I'm doing interviews with people that I've grown up watching on screen, or screenwriters that I admire or directors I admire, I get really nervous. Was there anybody in this documentary that you were really nervous about interviewing because you had idolized them throughout your life?
Yeah, I think. Well, I don't know about throughout my life, but Stuart Gordon, I think, was made us a little nervous to get him on camera. And he's not with us anymore. He's the director of Reanimator, and he was really good friends with Bob. He used to actually. Bob had the ability to go out and find stuff, to go to thrift stores and pick up items and make them into something. Stuart Gordon told us stories about going out with him and doing that. We were a little intimidated by him, but he was such a nice guy, and I'm really glad we got him on film. We're probably not the only ones, but it was near the end of his life, and he seemed very vital when we interviewed him.
Yeah, you mentioned before about the documentary. A documentary is always changing when you're working on a doco. Was there any stories that you came across while you were doing your research that kind of changed the path of the documentary for you in a major way?
Yeah, sure. We interviewed a filmmaker who had worked with Bob, and he just offhandedly said, "But did Bob ever tell you the story about the time he saw a guy killed?" And we said, "No, but now we have to film that." And so we had to go about filming this scene this guy had just told us about. And that kind of thing happened as we were going along. So you kind of just have to accept it and figure out what you're going to do with it. The very beginning of the film is in a tunnel, and I saw the movie The Third Man, and I called up my editor. This is pretty late in the process, and I said, I want that like subterranean look. You know, it's the French subway system or underground, whatever not subway system, but sewer. And so my editor said, "Well, I know a place. Let's go do it." And so we did. And then I found out later that The Third Man, that scene was shot in a studio. We shot it in the real thing, and that's the very opening of the film, and also the very ending of it. And it was one of the later things we did. So it's fun for me as the filmmaker to be able to say, "Hey, let's just go do that." And my editor was used to people saying no to stuff. And instead, I would say, "Okay, let's do it." And so we did.
Now, I found after I watched this documentary, I'd always been a fan of Bob, but I didn't know that much about Rondo. So I've been hunting down a lot of Rondo's films to sit down and watch. Do you think there'll be a lot of people out there that do the same thing, especially for a lot of the younger generation that might not even be aware of some of Bob's films as well?
Yeah, I hope so, yeah. I think Rondo deserves to be better known than he is. I'd be happy if somebody made a big feature film about Rondo, a big budget, film about him. I think it would be great. He did good work. He didn't really think of himself as an actor. I think he always thought of himself as a writer. He was a newspaper reporter in Tampa, Florida, and a movie called House of Horrors was shot there. And he was sent there as a reporter to write about it. And the director, Henry King, said, with this look, I've got to put you in the movie. And so he's like a bar owner in that movie. And Henry King said, "Come on out to Hollywood, and I'll make you a star." And he did. He was in a lot, mostly small things, but he was close to becoming the next big thing. He was touted as the next Boris Karloff.
Wow.
But because of his condition, he died young.
Yeah.
And 2 of his films came out posthumously. So.
Well, Joe, I certainly look forward to being able to watch more of Rondo's films over the next few weeks. But to finish up our interview, what would you like to say to our listeners out there who are about to sit down and watch your documentary?
Approach it with an open mind and fall into the story of these guys. It's been called a love letter to horror fans, but I don't think you need to be a horror fan to enjoy it. I've had a situation at a couple of film festivals. We've been on the film festival circuit where significant others of fans were drugged to the screening and told me afterward, "I didn't expect to like this, but I really did." And so I'd like more of that. It's a film for horror fans, but it's also just its secret is it's a love story. So take of that what you will.